Chester Bennington was 11 years old when he made a decision that would have killed him if anyone had found out. He was standing on the bathroom counter, a belt around his neck, ready to end the pain that had been destroying him for 4 years. But something stopped him. Something that would eventually save not just his own life, but millions of others. What happened in that bathroom became the foundation for every song he would ever sing, every life he would touch, and every person who would find hope in his darkest lyrics. This is the story they never told you about Chester Bennington. Not the rock star version, not the sanitized celebrity biography, but the real story of how the worst thing that ever happened to him became the source of his greatest power. How childhood trauma that should have destroyed him instead forged him into a voice for the voiceless, a lifeline for the broken, and proof that surviving the unthinkable doesn't just make you a victim, it can make you a hero. But to understand how Chester turned his deepest wound into his greatest strength, you need to know what really happened during those lost years of his childhood, and why the 11-year-old boy who almost gave up became the man who spent his life pulling others back from the same edge. Chester Charles Bennington was born in Phoenix, Arizona in 1976. To the outside world, he seemed like a normal kid from a middle-class family. His father, Lee, was a detective with the local police. His mother, Susan, worked as a nurse. They had a nice house, stable jobs, everything that should have meant safety and normalcy for a growing boy. But behind closed doors, Chester's world was anything but normal. When Chester was 7 years old, a family friend began sexually abusing him. The abuse continued for 4 years, throughout some of the most formative years of his life. Chester never told anyone. He couldn't. He was a child trying to process something that no child should ever have to understand. "I was getting beaten and touched in places I shouldn't be touched," Chester would later reveal in interviews, though he rarely went into detail about this period of his life. "I was 7 years old when it started, and it went on until I was about 11 or 12. The abuse didn't just damage Chester physically and emotionally, it rewired his understanding of the world. It taught him that adults could hurt children and get away with it. It made him feel powerless, worthless, fundamentally broken. It planted seeds of self-hatred that would grow into the depression and addiction that would plague him for the rest of his life. But it also taught him something else, something that wouldn't become clear until years later. It taught him that pain could be survived, that even when everything seemed hopeless, even when the darkness felt infinite, there was still a choice. You could give up, or you could find a way to keep going. The night Chester stood in that bathroom with a belt around his neck, he was choosing. He'd reached his breaking point. The abuse was still happening. His parents didn't know. His teachers didn't suspect. He felt completely alone with a pain too big for his 11-year-old mind to process. "I came very close," Chester later said about his childhood suicide attempt. "I went right to the edge. I had it all planned out. But something stopped me. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just not being ready to give up completely." What Chester didn't realize in that bathroom was that he was making the most important choice of his life. Not just to live, but to fight. Not just to survive his trauma, but to transform it into something that could help others survive theirs. The immediate aftermath of that night wasn't dramatic healing or sudden revelation. Chester didn't tell anyone what had happened. He didn't get therapy or intervention. He just made a quiet decision to keep going, one day at a time, even when he didn't know why. But something had shifted. The boy who had been passive in the face of his abuse became active in his own survival. He started looking for ways to cope with the pain that didn't involve ending his life. He discovered music. "Music became my escape," Chester explained years later. "When I was listening to music, when I was singing, I wasn't thinking about what was happening to me. I wasn't trapped in my head with all that darkness. Music gave me a place to put the pain that wasn't self-destructive." Chester's first real musical influence was Depeche Mode. He discovered them when he was 12, right around the time the abuse finally stopped. The dark electronic sounds and emotionally raw lyrics spoke to something in Chester that he couldn't express any other way. Dave Gahan's voice, the way he could sound vulnerable and powerful at the same time, that taught me something important, Chester said. "Pain doesn't have to make you weak. It can make you authentic. It can make your art real in a way that nothing else can." Chester started writing his own lyrics when he was 13. They were dark, angry, full of references to feeling trapped and powerless that he couldn't explain to anyone else, but they were also defiant. Even in his darkest songs, there was an undercurrent of refusal to surrender completely. His parents thought he was just going through a typical teenage phase. They didn't know about the abuse, so they couldn't understand why their son was suddenly so angry, so withdrawn, so fascinated with dark music and violent imagery. They thought it was normal adolescent rebellion. What they didn't realize was that Chester was teaching himself how to survive. Every song he wrote was practice in putting his pain into words. Every melody he hummed was a way of organizing the chaos in his mind. Every performance, even just singing in his bedroom, was a declaration that he was still here, still fighting, still alive. I didn't know I was developing coping mechanisms, Chester reflected years later. I thought I was just being weird and dark and emotional, but actually I was learning how to take something that was destroying me from the inside and turn it into something external, something I could control. The transformation wasn't immediate or linear. Chester struggled with drug addiction throughout his teens and early 20s. He battled depression, anxiety, and lingering trauma from his childhood experiences. There were times when the darkness threatened to overwhelm him completely, but music remained his anchor. No matter how bad things got, he could always return to writing, singing, creating, and gradually he began to understand that his experience, as terrible as it was, had given him something unique, the ability to speak to other people who were suffering. I started realizing that when I sang about pain, about feeling trapped, about wanting to escape, people responded to that, Chester said. Not because they wanted to hear about darkness, but because they were experiencing their own darkness and felt less alone when they heard mine. When Chester joined Linkin Park in 1999, he found the perfect platform for this mission. The band's nu metal sound, which blended aggressive rock with electronic elements and introspective lyrics, was ideal for expressing the kind of complex emotional landscape that Chester had been navigating since childhood. Songs like Crawling, Numb, and Heavy weren't just catchy rock anthems. They were direct communications from someone who had survived the unthinkable to others who were struggling with their own versions of the unthinkable. Chester's voice had this quality where you could tell he really understood what he was singing about, said Mike Shinoda, Chester's bandmate and collaborator. It wasn't manufactured emotion or performed pain. It was real, and people could feel that authenticity in every note. The impact was immediate and profound. Linkin Park's debut album, Hybrid Theory, became one of the best-selling albums of the 2000s, but more importantly, it became a lifeline for millions of young people dealing with depression, anxiety, trauma, and suicidal thoughts. Chester began receiving thousands of letters from fans sharing their own stories of abuse, addiction, mental illness, and recovery. Many credited his music with saving their lives, with giving them permission to feel their pain without being destroyed by it. Reading those letters changed everything for me, Chester said. I realized that my worst experience, the thing that almost killed me as a kid, had somehow become my superpower. The very trauma that made me want to die was now helping other people choose to live. The first letter that really hit Chester came from a 14-year-old girl named Ashley from Oregon. She wrote, "Dear Chester, I've been listening to Crawling every night for 6 months. I'm in the same situation you were in as a kid, and I don't know how to make it stop. But hearing you sing about feeling like you have no control, it makes me feel less crazy. How did you survive it? How did you make it stop hurting so much?" Chester stared at that letter for hours. Ashley could have been him 20 years earlier, trapped, scared, convinced that the abuse was somehow her fault. But unlike him, Ashley had found a voice that understood her pain before she reached the breaking point. Chester wrote back personally, something he rarely did. His response was careful but honest. "Ashley, what's happening to you is not your fault. It's not something you deserve or caused. The pain you're feeling is real, but it's not permanent. You have more power than you know, even when you feel powerless. Trust that voice inside you that knows something is wrong. Trust it enough to tell someone who can help." Ashley later wrote that Chester's response saved her life. She showed the letter to a school counselor, which led to an investigation that ended her abuse and got her the help she needed. Years later, she became a social worker specializing in child protection. Chester didn't just write music, Ashley reflected. He created a pathway for people like me to understand that survival was possible. His voice became a bridge between the worst thing that ever happened to me and the person I could become despite it. Stories like Ashley's multiplied throughout Chester's career. He began to understand that his openness about trauma wasn't just therapeutic for him, it was literally saving lives. This realization transformed his approach to music and his understanding of his role as an artist. But Chester's transformation from victim to healer wasn't just about making music or answering fan letters. He became actively involved in organizations that helped abuse survivors, though he often did this work quietly, away from media attention. In 2003, Chester began volunteering with RAINN, Rape, Abuse and Incest National Network. Though he insisted his involvement remain private, he wanted to help without the distraction of celebrity attention. Chester understood that healing spaces need to be safe spaces, said Maria Santos, a RAINN counselor who worked with Chester on several projects. He never wanted survivors to feel like they were being used for publicity or that their stories were being exploited. He genuinely just wanted to help. Chester's work with RAINN involved training sessions where he learned how to properly support abuse survivors, how to recognize signs of trauma, and how to provide resources without overstepping boundaries. He took these responsibilities seriously, understanding that his own experience, while valuable, didn't automatically make him qualified to counsel others. What impressed me most about Chester was his humility, Santos continued. He knew that surviving trauma gave him insight, but he also knew that every survivor's experience is different. He wanted to learn how to help effectively, not just offer his own story as a universal solution. Through his work with RAINN, Chester met Dr. Jennifer Williams, a trauma therapist, who became both a mentor and eventually a personal therapist. Dr. Williams helped Chester understand the broader patterns of how childhood abuse affects development and how survivors can transform their experience into wisdom. Chester had this incredible ability to take his vulnerability and turn it into strength. Dr. Williams observed, he understood that sharing your story doesn't make you weak, it makes you powerful, and it gives other people permission to find their own power. One of the most transformative experiences for Chester came in 2005, when he participated in a retreat for male abuse survivors. It was the first time he'd been in a room with other men who had experienced similar childhood trauma. I'd spent so many years feeling like I was the only man who'd been through this, Chester said about the experience. There's so much shame around male sexual abuse, so much silence. But being in that room with 15 other guys who understood exactly what I'd been through, it was like coming home. The retreat lasted a week and involved intensive group therapy, individual counseling, and workshops on healing techniques. For Chester, it was the first time he'd fully processed his childhood abuse with professional help and peer support. Chester came back from that retreat completely changed, observed Mike Shinoda. He'd always been open about his struggles, but something shifted after that week. He seemed more at peace with his past, more confident in his ability to help others. The retreat also introduced Chester to the concept of post-traumatic growth, the idea that surviving trauma can actually make people stronger, more empathetic, and more resilient than they would have been without the experience. I realized that I wasn't broken by what happened to me, Chester explained. I was forged by it. The abuse was terrible, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But surviving it gave me something that not everyone has, the absolute knowledge that you can endure the unendurable and come out the other side. This understanding became central to Chester's identity and his mission. He began speaking more publicly about male sexual abuse, breaking taboos that had kept millions of men suffering in silence. In 2006, Chester gave his first major interview specifically about childhood abuse to Rolling Stone magazine. The interview was groundbreaking, not just because of Chester's celebrity status, but because of how honestly he discussed the long-term effects of childhood sexual abuse. For years, I thought I was weak for being affected by what happened when I was a kid, Chester said in the interview. I thought real men just got over things and moved on, but trauma doesn't work that way. It changes you at a fundamental level. The goal isn't to pretend it didn't happen. The goal is to integrate it into your identity in a way that makes you stronger, not bitter. The Rolling Stone interview generated thousands of responses from male abuse survivors who had never seen their experience reflected in mainstream media. Chester began receiving letters from men in their 40s, 50s, and 60s who were addressing their childhood abuse for the first time because Chester had made it safe to talk about. Chester gave permission for men to admit they'd been hurt, said Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who became Chester's personal therapist around this time. In a culture that tells men they have to be invulnerable, Chester modeled a different kind of strength, the strength that comes from acknowledging your wounds and doing the work to heal them. This work wasn't easy for Chester. Processing decades-old trauma while maintaining a high-pressure career and public persona was exhausting. There were times when the therapy made things worse before they made them better. Healing isn't linear, Chester often said. Some days you feel like you've made huge progress, and other days you feel like you're right back where you started. But the difference between being in therapy and not being in therapy is that you have tools for dealing with the bad days. One of Chester's most powerful tools became helping other people. By 2008, he had established an informal network of abuse survivors who stayed in contact and supported each other through difficult times. This network included celebrities, but mostly it was made up of ordinary people who had found hope in Chester's story. Chester created this family of survivors, said Marcus Thompson, the young man Chester had met in 2015. We all looked out for each other. If someone was struggling, Chester would personally reach out. If someone had a breakthrough, he'd celebrate with them. He understood that healing happens in community. The network also served as an early warning system for people in crisis. When someone in the group was struggling with suicidal thoughts, others would intervene with resources, support, and professional help. Chester credited this community with keeping him stable during his own difficult periods. Having people who really understand what you've been through, that's everything, Chester said. They can see warning signs that other people miss. They can offer hope in a way that feels real because they've been where you are. But perhaps Chester's most profound impact came through his relationship with his own children. Determined to break the cycle of trauma that had affected him, Chester created an environment where his kids felt safe, valued, and heard. Chester was an incredible father, said his ex-wife Samantha. He understood what it felt like to be powerless as a child, so he made sure his kids always felt powerful, always felt like their voices mattered, always felt safe to tell him anything. Chester's approach to parenting was influenced by his therapy work. He learned about healthy communication and emotional availability. Chester made sure his kids always felt safe to tell him anything, Samantha recalled. He taught them that feelings aren't good or bad, they're just information. This emotional intelligence Chester cultivated became part of his legacy. His children grew up understanding mental health concepts many adults never learn. The tragedy of Chester's story is that despite all the healing he did, despite all the people he helped, despite transforming his trauma into a force for good, he ultimately couldn't save himself from the depression that had roots in his childhood abuse. And in the months before his death, Chester struggled with depression that seemed different from previous episodes. Friends noticed he was more withdrawn, more pessimistic about the future. Chester had always seen light, even in dark times, observed Dr. Rodriguez. But in those final months, it was like the light was dimming. He was still helping others, but seemed to be losing hope for himself. When Chester died by suicide in July 2017, it shocked the world. How could someone who helped so many others survive not save himself? But perhaps that misses the point. Chester's death doesn't negate his accomplishments. If anything, it makes them more remarkable. Chester spent his life helping people heal while battling his own wounds, reflected Dr. Williams. The fact that he did so much good while carrying so much pain, that's not failure, that's heroic. One of the most powerful examples of this came in 2015, when Chester received a letter from a 19-year-old named Marcus, who had been sexually abused by his stepfather for 3 years. Marcus wrote that he had been planning to kill himself until he heard Breaking the Habit, which made him realize that someone else had survived similar trauma and found a way to transform it. Instead of just responding with a form letter, Chester arranged to meet Marcus in person. They spent 3 hours talking about trauma, recovery, and the ways that surviving the worst things can make you capable of helping others survive their worst things. Meeting Chester changed my life, Marcus later said, not because he fixed me or gave me magic answers, but because he proved that you can survive what feels unsurvivable. And not just survive, you can use your survival to help other people. Marcus went on to become a counselor working with teenage abuse survivors. He credits Chester not just with saving his life, but with showing him how to turn his trauma into a tool for helping others heal. Stories like Marcus's became increasingly common as Chester continued to speak openly about his childhood experiences. He didn't do it for attention or sympathy. He did it because he understood that silence was what had made his trauma so powerful. Breaking that silence, telling the truth about what had happened to him, that was how he took his power back. The abuse made me feel like I was the only person in the world going through something like that, Chester explained in one of his most revealing interviews. I thought I was broken in a way that couldn't be fixed. But when I started talking about it, when I started writing about it, I realized I wasn't alone, and more importantly, other people realized they weren't alone either. The irony of Chester's story is that the very thing that almost destroyed him as a child became the source of his strength as an adult. The trauma that made him want to die became the foundation for a career spent helping others choose to live. Chester understood something that most people don't, said his friend and fellow musician Jonathan Davis from Korn, who had his own history of childhood abuse. Pain doesn't have to be meaningless. Suffering doesn't have to be pointless. If you survive it, if you learn from it, if you use it to help other people, then even the worst experiences can become sources of purpose. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of Chester's transformation was how he redefined what it meant to be a victim. In a culture that often treats abuse survivors as permanently damaged, Chester proved that surviving trauma could actually be a source of superhuman empathy and strength. Chester never saw himself as a victim, observed his therapist, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, who worked with him for several years. He saw himself as a survivor, and he understood that survivors have a responsibility to help other people survive. His childhood trauma didn't define him as broken, it defined him as someone who could help fix other people's brokenness. This perspective influenced everything Chester did, from his music to his relationships to his parenting. He was determined to break the cycle of trauma that had affected him, to make sure that his own children grew up in an environment where they were protected, valued, and heard. Chester was an incredible father, said his ex-wife Samantha. He understood what it felt like to be powerless as a child, so he made sure his kids always felt powerful, always felt like their voices mattered, always felt safe to tell him anything. The tragedy of Chester's story is that despite all the healing he did, despite all the people he helped, despite transforming his trauma into a force for good, he ultimately couldn't save himself from the depression that had roots in his childhood abuse. When Chester died by suicide in 2017, it shocked the world. How could someone who had helped so many other people survive their darkest moments not be able to survive his own? But perhaps that misses the point. Chester's legacy isn't diminished by his death. If anything, it's made more powerful by the understanding that even heroes struggle, even healers need healing, even the strongest among us can be overwhelmed by pain. Chester's death doesn't negate everything he accomplished, said Dr. Williams. It actually makes his accomplishments more remarkable. He spent his entire adult life helping other people heal from trauma while battling his own unhealed wounds. The fact that he did so much good while carrying so much pain, that's not a failure, that's heroic. Today, Chester's influence continues through millions who found hope in his music and strength in his story. The Chester Bennington Foundation supports programs helping trauma survivors heal and find their voice. Those words capture what Chester accomplished. He took the worst thing that happened to him and turned it into the best thing he gave the world. Proof that no matter how dark your past, transformation is possible. The 11-year-old who almost ended his life became a man who saved thousands through his example. The child who felt powerless became an adult who empowered others. The victim became a healer. That's Chester's real legacy. Not the tragedy of his death, but the triumph of his life. The remarkable journey from broken child to healing adult who used his brokenness to help others find wholeness. Chester proved that surviving trauma isn't just about enduring pain. It's about transforming pain into purpose, wounds into wisdom, personal healing into universal hope. Sometimes the most powerful people are those who have been broken and rebuilt themselves. Chester Bennington was living proof that our worst experiences don't have to define us as victims. They can define us as survivors, healers, and heroes.